In a small, peaceful town surrounded by green hills and vast open fields, there lived a man named Jack. He wasn't flashy or loud. He was just an ordinary guy who loved his land. His family had owned the ranch for generations, and it held countless memories. Childhood summers chasing cows, late-night bonfires under starry skies, and early mornings spent fixing fences. To Jack, this place wasn't just property, it was home. The ranch sat at the edge of a growing neighborhood filled with new houses. These homes were tidy, modern, and looked like they belonged in a magazine. Most of the people living there were city folks who had moved to the countryside seeking fresh air and space. They weren't farmers or ranchers, but professionals with desk jobs who enjoyed weekend barbecues and lawnmower races. For years, Jack didn't mind them. In fact, he liked having neighbors around, even if their lives seemed so different from his. One thing about Jack's ranch made it special: a dirt path that cut through his land. It wasn't official, but over time it became a convenient shortcut for some of the residents. If you lived on the far side of the development, taking the dirt road saved nearly 10 minutes compared to driving all the way around. At first, only a few cars used it occasionally, and Jack didn't think much of it. After all, he believed in being neighborly. Plus, it wasn't causing any trouble. But then things started changing. A group of homeowners decided to form something called a homeowners association, or HOA for short. This HOA was supposed to keep the neighborhood looking nice and make sure everyone followed certain rules. Sounds reasonable, right? But soon enough, the HOA began acting more like bosses than helpful neighbors. Rules popped up left and right. No bright-colored doors, no clotheslines visible from the street, no parking RVs overnight. People whispered that the HOA cared more about appearances than actual community spirit. Then came the day when Jack's life took a sharp turn. Without warning, workers showed up one morning and put up a tall chain-link fence right across his driveway. Just like that, his main access point to the ranch was blocked off completely. When Jack asked what was going on, he was told it was part of enforcing regulations. Apparently, his driveway didn't meet some new standards set by the HOA. No discussions, no compromises, just a cold decision handed down from above. Jack couldn't believe it. How could they do this? His driveway wasn't hurting anyone. It had been there long before most of these fancy houses existed, and now, suddenly, it was illegal? He tried talking to the HOA members, hoping to find common ground. Maybe they'd agree to move the fence slightly or give him permission to use another entrance, but every conversation ended the same way, with vague promises or outright dismissal. One member even told him, "You'll adjust. Everyone has to follow the rules." Days turned into weeks, and Jack felt trapped. The fence wasn't just inconvenient, it was infuriating. Every trip to town meant driving miles out of his way. Deliveries stopped coming because trucks couldn't reach his barn. Even emergency services warned him they might struggle to get to his house quickly if needed. Yet, despite all this hassle, the HOA refused to budge. They acted like their rules mattered more than his livelihood. And here's where the story gets even stranger. While Jack dealt with the frustration of losing his driveway, he noticed something odd happening at night. Despite blocking his access, some of those same HOA members continued using the dirt shortcut across his land. Late at night, headlights would appear, cutting through his fields and leaving deep tire marks behind. By morning, the once pristine pasture looked like a muddy mess. Gates were left open, letting livestock wander where they shouldn't. Irrigation pipes got crushed under heavy tires. Jack couldn't understand it. Why would people complain about his driveway not meeting standards yet feel entitled to drive across his private property whenever they wanted? It felt hypocritical and disrespectful. So, he started documenting everything. Every broken fence post, every flattened crop, every muddy rut left behind. He snapped photos and kept notes. He hoped the evidence would convince the HOA to stop the trespassing, but when he presented it to them, they brushed it off. One member actually said, "Well, maybe if your land wasn't such a convenient route." That comment hit Jack hard. Convenient? Was that all his land meant to them? A shortcut? All his hard work? All his history? Reduced to nothing more than a path for lazy drivers? Something inside him snapped. Enough was enough. If the HOA thought they could treat him this way, then he'd show them exactly how serious he was about protecting what belonged to him. Little did they know Jack was about to take matters into his own hands, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jack wasn't the kind of person to sit back and let things slide. He had always been someone who stood up for what he believed in, even if it meant going against the crowd. But this situation with the HOA felt different. It wasn't just about rules or property. It was personal. These people weren't just neighbors anymore, they were invaders. They had taken away his access to his own land and then acted like it was okay to trample all over it whenever it suited them. The more Jack thought about it, the angrier he got. The HOA members, on the other hand, seemed to live in a completely different world. Most of them didn't understand ranch life. They didn't know what it meant to wake up before sunrise to check on cattle or spend hours fixing fences that kept animals safe. To them, Jack's ranch was just an eyesore, a patch of untamed wilderness that didn't fit their vision of a perfect neighborhood. Some whispered behind his back, calling him stubborn and unreasonable. "He needs to get with the times," one neighbor said during a community meeting. Another chimed in. "If he can't follow simple guidelines, maybe he should sell." But selling wasn't an option for Jack. This land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was his family's legacy. His grandfather had worked the soil with his bare hands. His father had taught him how to mend fences and care for livestock. Every corner of the ranch held a memory, a story, a piece of who he was. Selling would mean erasing all of that, and Jack couldn't imagine doing that, not for anyone, and certainly not for a group of people who barely acknowledged his existence unless it benefited them. As weeks went by, the tension between Jack and the HOA grew thicker than the summer heat. Gossip spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People talked about how difficult Jack was being, labeling him as anti-community. A few even suggested that his refusal to comply with the HOA's demands made him selfish. One woman at a coffee shop told her friend, "I don't see why. He's making such a big deal out of this. It's just a driveway." Just a driveway? To Jack, it was so much more. It was his connection to the outside world, his lifeline to supplies, deliveries, and emergency services. Blocking it off felt like cutting off his air supply. What made matters worse was the hypocrisy of it all. While the HOA blocked Jack's driveway, claiming it was necessary to maintain order, they turned a blind eye to the fact that their own members were using his land as a shortcut. At first it was subtle, a car here and there sneaking across his fields late at night. But soon it became a regular occurrence. Tire tracks crisscrossed his once pristine pastures, turning soft earth into muddy trenches. Gates were left wide open, letting cows wander into areas they weren't supposed to be. Fences that took hours to repair were torn down again within. Jack tried everything he could think of to stop the trespassing. He posted signs along the edges of his property. Private property, no trespassing. He installed motion-activated lights to scare off nighttime drivers. He even called the sheriff a few times when he caught cars parked suspiciously near his fields. But nothing worked. The trespassers kept coming, and the damage kept piling up. Each morning, Jack woke up to find fresh scars on his land. Reminders that his warnings were being ignored. The breaking point came one chilly autumn evening. Jack had spent the day hauling hay bales into the barn, preparing for winter. Exhausted, he sat on his porch sipping coffee and watching the sun dip below the horizon. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable rumble of an engine tearing through his field. Furious, he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the noise. By the time he reached the source, the car was already speeding away, leaving behind deep ruts in the damp soil. Standing there in the dark, surrounded by destruction, Jack felt defeated. He had done everything he could to protect his property, but it wasn't enough. The HOA had taken away his ability to fight back legally, and now their members were exploiting his land without consequences. Something inside him shifted in that moment. He realized he couldn't rely on anyone else to stand up for him. Not the HOA, not the sheriff, not even his neighbors. If he wanted justice, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. Over the next few days, Jack began researching ways to stop the trespassers once and for all. He scrolled through online forums, read articles, and watched videos until he stumbled upon something that caught his attention: spike strips. These devices were designed to puncture tires and immobilize vehicles, often used by law enforcement to stop fleeing suspects. Jack knew they weren't toys. They were serious tools meant for dangerous situations, but desperation has a way of clouding judgment, and Jack felt desperate. He ordered the spike strips online, choosing ones that looked sturdy and reliable. When they arrived, he carefully unpacked them, inspecting each strip to make sure it worked properly. Then, under the cover of darkness, he installed them along the most used paths across his land. He buried them slightly beneath the surface so they wouldn't be immediately visible, but positioned them strategically to catch any vehicle daring enough to cross. Once everything was in place, Jack stepped back and surveyed his work. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this would finally send a message. The waiting game began. Jack didn't know how long it would take for someone to fall victim to the spike strips, or if they'd even work at all. But he was patient. He had learned patience from years of working the land, knowing that sometimes you had to wait for the right moment to act. Meanwhile, he kept an eye on his property, watching for any signs of trouble. He didn't tell anyone what he had done, not his family, not his friends. This was his battle, and he intended to face the consequences alone. Little did Jack know, his plan was about to set off a chain reaction that would change the entire neighborhood. Word would spread quickly once the first car fell victim to the spikes. Panic would ripple through the community as more and more drivers found themselves stranded with flat tires. And eventually, everyone, from the HOA members to local authorities, would start pointing fingers, trying to figure out who was responsible. But for now, Jack simply waited, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Would the spike strips work? Would the trespassers finally learn their lesson? Or would this only escalate the conflict further? One thing was certain. Whatever happened, Jack was ready to face it head on. After all, he had nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. It didn't take long for the spike strips to do their job. Late one evening, as Jack sat on his porch listening to the crickets chirp and sipping a cup of strong coffee, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel, followed by an abrupt screech. Then came the telltale hiss of air escaping from punctured rubber. His heart raced, but he stayed calm, gripping the arms of his chair as he waited to see what would happen next. The car, a shiny black SUV, came to a halt, right in the middle of his field. The driver stepped out, flashlight in hand, scanning the ground around the vehicle. Jack watched silently from the shadows of his porch, hidden by the darkness. He could hear the man muttering under his breath, clearly frustrated. After inspecting the tires, the driver pulled out his phone and made a call. From the bits of conversation Jack could overhear, it sounded like he was calling roadside assistance. By morning, word had spread through the neighborhood. Someone posted about the incident in the HOA's private online group, describing how their brand new SUV had been ruined after driving through Jack's land. The post quickly gained traction, with comments flooding in. Some people sympathized with the stranded driver, while others accused him of being reckless for ignoring private property signs. But no one suspected foul play, at least not yet. Over. The next few days, more cars fell victim to the spike strips. Each time the scene played out similarly. Late-night drivers cutting through the field, sudden tire blowouts, frantic calls for help. Some abandoned their vehicles and walked home in frustration. Others waited hours for tow trucks to arrive. Tire shops in town reported a surge in business, with multiple customers bringing in cars with mysterious flat tires. It wasn't long before patterns began to emerge. Neighbors started talking. At first they joked about bad luck or cursed shortcuts, but soon suspicion crept in. One woman mentioned noticing deep grooves in the dirt where the spikes were buried. Another neighbor pointed out that all the incidents seemed to occur along the same paths across Jack's property. People began exchanging theories, accusing each other of sabotage. Tensions rose as paranoia set in. No one wanted to admit they'd been using Jack's land without permission, especially now that doing so came with consequences. Meanwhile, Jack kept quiet. He went about his daily routine as usual, feeding livestock, fixing fences, and tending to chores around the ranch. If anyone asked him directly about the spike strips, he shrugged and said nothing. Let them wonder. Let them panic. He figured the fewer words he spoke, the better. Besides, he had already warned them. His signs clearly stated private property and no trespassing. They had chosen to ignore those warnings. Now they were facing the fallout. As the number of flat tires grew, so did the anger among the trespassers. Finally, someone decided to confront Jack directly. It was a man who lived 2 streets over, known for his short temper and love of expensive gadgets. He stormed onto Jack's porch one afternoon, red-faced and fuming. "All right, I know it's you," he shouted, jabbing a finger toward Jack. "You've got some kind of trap set up out there, don't you? What gives you the right to mess with people's cars?" Jack leaned against the railing, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You're trespassing," he said simply. "I put up signs. You chose not to listen." "That doesn't give you the right to destroy my property," the man snapped back. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to replace 4 tires? This is ridiculous." "Funny," Jack replied, his voice steady. "I've been telling the HOA for months that people are tearing up my fields and damaging my fences. Did anyone care? Nope. So maybe now y'all will think twice before cutting through my land." The man opened his mouth to argue further, but Jack cut him off. "If you don't want your tires popped, stay off my property, simple as that." With that, he turned and walked inside, leaving the man standing there seething. Word of the confrontation spread quickly. More neighbors came forward, admitting they had also driven through Jack's fields. Some tried reasoning with him, offering to pay for damages if he removed the spike strips. Others demanded answers from the HOA, claiming its policies had forced them to use the shortcut in the first place. The HOA board held an emergency meeting to discuss the situation, but opinions were divided. Some members sided with Jack, acknowledging that the trespassing was wrong. Others doubled down, insisting Jack was overreacting and needed to find a more civilized solution. Despite the growing chaos, Jack refused to back down. Every night he checked the spike strips to ensure they were still in place. Occasionally he'd find remnants of shredded tires lodged in the metal teeth, proof that his plan was working. Drivers learned the hard way that taking shortcuts came with risks. Slowly but surely, the number of trespassers dwindled. The once busy dirt paths became eerily quiet again, just as they had been before the HOA drama began. But the peace didn't last long. One evening, as Jack finished dinner, a knock echoed through his house. When he opened the door, 2 police officers stood on his porch, their faces grim. "We need to talk to you about some reports we've received," one of them said. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew this moment might come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. The officers explained that several residents had filed complaints alleging vandalism and intentional property damage. They asked Jack if he had installed any devices on his property designed to harm vehicles. Jack hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. Lying wouldn't help. He had always been upfront about protecting his land. So, he admitted to setting up the spike strips but defended his actions, explaining the history of trespassing and the HOA's refusal to address the issue. The officers listened patiently, jotting down notes before reminding Jack that his methods, while understandable, could lead to legal trouble. They advised him to remove the spike strips immediately and warned him that failure to comply could result in charges. As they drove away, Jack stood in the doorway, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. He knew he was walking a fine line between justice and retaliation, but deep down, he couldn't bring himself to regret what he had done. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jack replayed the events in his mind. He thought about the countless times he had tried to reason with the HOA, only to be dismissed. He remembered the frustration of finding his fields torn apart and his gates left open, and he recalled the sense of satisfaction he'd felt when the trespassers finally faced consequences for their actions. Maybe he had gone too far, or maybe he had simply leveled the playing field. Either way, the battle was far from over. The news of Jack's spike strip spread like wildfire, turning what had been a local neighborhood dispute into something much bigger. Neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now openly debated the situation at coffee shops, grocery stores, and school pickup lines. Some sided with Jack, seeing him as a man pushed to his limits by an overbearing HOA and entitled trespassers. Others condemned his actions, calling them dangerous and unnecessary. The divide grew deeper, pitting neighbor against neighbor in a way no one had anticipated. Local media caught wind of the story, and soon reporters started showing up in the area. They parked their vans near Jack's ranch, cameras and microphones, ready to capture sound bites from anyone willing to talk. One reporter interviewed a woman whose car had fallen victim to the spikes. She stood beside her SUV, gesturing dramatically toward its flattened tires. "I just wanted to save a few minutes," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "I didn't think I'd end up stranded in the middle of nowhere with 4 blown-out tires. This is ridiculous." Another resident, however, took a different stance. A retired farmer who lived down the road told the camera, "Jack's got every right to protect his land. If people are sneaking through his fields after he's told them not to, then they deserve what they get. You don't go trampling someone else's property and expect them to smile about it." As opinions clashed, the story gained traction online. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like "Justice for Jack" and "Stop the Trespassers." Comment sections erupted into heated arguments, with strangers weighing in from across the country. Some praised Jack for standing up to bullies, while others criticized him for taking matters into his own hands. Talk show hosts dedicated entire segments to the controversy, debating whether homeowners associations wielded too much power or if individuals should be allowed to enforce their rights so aggressively. Amidst the chaos, the HOA scrambled to regain control of the narrative. At an emergency meeting, board members argued over how to handle the situation. Should they apologize to Jack and remove the fence blocking his driveway? Or should they pursue legal action against him for damaging vehicles? Tensions ran high, with some members accusing each other of mishandling the conflict from the start. In the end, they decided to file a lawsuit, claiming Jack's spike strips constituted intentional property damage and harassment. When Jack received the official notice, he wasn't surprised, but that didn't make it any easier. Sitting at his kitchen table, he read through the document multiple times, his jaw tightening with each line. The HOA was suing him for thousands of dollars in damages, plus attorney fees. They demanded he remove the spike strips immediately and pay restitution to everyone affected. Worst of all, they hinted at possible criminal charges if he refused to cooperate. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had he gone too far? Could he afford to fight this battle in court? But as he stared out the window at his fields that had been torn apart by careless drivers, he reminded ownself why he had done what he did. He hadn't acted out of malice. He had acted out of desperation. The HOA had taken away his ability to access his own land, then turned a blind eye when its members trespassed on it. What choice did he have but to defend himself? Determined to see this through, Jack hired a lawyer, a grizzled old man with decades of experience fighting for underdogs. Together, they prepared for the legal showdown ahead. Jack gathered every piece of evidence he had: photos of tire tracks, ruining his pastures, broken fences left unrepaired, irrigation pipes crushed beyond use. He also dug up records of his attempts to reason with the HOA, including emails and voicemails where he pleaded for solutions only to be ignored or dismissed. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Reporters filled the back rows, scribbling notes and snapping pictures. Residents from both sides of the issue sat tense and silent, waiting to hear what the judge would say. The HOA's lawyer painted Jack as reckless and unreasonable, accusing him of endangering lives with his spike strips. "This isn't self-defense," the lawyer argued. "It's vigilantism. My client simply wanted to maintain order in their community, and Mr. Thompson retaliated with violence." Jack's lawyer countered passionately, presenting years' worth of documentation showing repeated trespassing and destruction of Jack's property. "My client has tried everything within legal means to resolve this issue," he said, his voice steady. "But when those efforts failed, and when the HOA refused to acknowledge the harm being done, he had no choice but to take drastic measures. Is it ideal? No. But neither is having your livelihood destroyed because someone else finds your land convenient. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions to both sides before adjourning to deliberate. For Jack, the wait felt endless. He sat outside the courthouse staring at the horizon, replaying every decision he had made leading up to this moment. Would the judge rule in his favor? Or would he face financial ruin and possibly jail time for defending his land? Finally, the verdict came. The judge acknowledged that Jack had legitimate grievances and that the HOA bore partial responsibility for creating the conditions that led to the conflict. However, the use of spike strips was deemed excessive and unlawful. Jack was ordered to remove them immediately and pay restitution to those whose vehicles had been damaged. On the flip side, the HOA was instructed to dismantle the fence blocking Jack's driveway and compensate him for past trespassing incidents. Neither side walked away happy. The HOA members grumbled about setting a bad precedent, while Jack stewed over the injustice of being penalized for protecting what belonged to him. Still, there was a small sense of relief. His driveway would finally be reopened, and the HOA couldn't ignore his complaints anymore. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was something. Back at the ranch, Jack spent days dismantling the spike strips. He worked quietly, his mind heavy with thoughts of what had happened. Relationships with his neighbors were beyond repair now. Once friendly faces avoided eye contact when they passed by. Conversations stopped altogether, replaced by awkward silences and lingering resentment. Jack missed the camaraderie he used to share with some of them, but he knew those days were gone forever. Despite the toll it had taken, Jack refused to regret his actions entirely. Yes, he had crossed a line, but so had the HOA. They had treated his land like it existed solely for their convenience, ignoring his rights and needs. By standing firm, he had sent a message. You can't trample on someone indefinitely without expecting resistance. Even if it cost him friendships and peace of mind, he believed it was worth it. As weeks turned into months, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could be. The shortcut through Jack's fields remained unused, its dirt paths overtaken by weeds. Tire tracks faded and the fields began healing. Jack focused on rebuilding, pouring his energy into fixing fences, planting crops, and caring for his animals. He still kept an eye out for trespassers, though he doubted anyone would dare cross his land again anytime soon. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack leaned against the porch railing, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. He thought about everything he had endured, the fights, the lawsuits, the broken relationships. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been fair. But through it all, he had stayed true to himself and his principles. His land was safe, his driveway was open, and his spirit remained unbroken. And sometimes, in moments like these, that was enough. Months passed since the trial, and life on Jack's ranch settled into a new rhythm. The spike strips were gone, dismantled piece by piece under the watchful eyes of the HOA representatives who showed up one morning to ensure compliance. Jack didn't argue or resist. He just worked silently, his jaw clenched as he yanked each metal strip from the ground. When they finally left, satisfied that he had followed the court's orders, Jack stood in the middle of his field for a long time staring at the scars left behind. Tire tracks had faded, but the memories hadn't. The fence blocking his driveway was also removed, per the judge's ruling. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack could drive straight to his barn without taking a detour through half the county. It should have been a relief, but it didn't feel like much of a victory. Every trip down that driveway reminded him of how hard he'd fought, and how little had actually changed. The HOA still existed, its members still complained about his messy property, and the tension between them remained thick enough to cut with a knife. But there were moments when Jack allowed himself to breathe easier. Mornings spent feeding cattle, afternoons fixing fences, evenings watching the sunset paint the sky. All these small joys helped him heal. He poured his energy into the land, nurturing it back to health after months of neglect and damage. The fields grew greener, the cows fatter, and the air smelled sweeter. Life moved forward, even if it wasn't perfect. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not just in his relationship with the neighbors, but within himself. Before the conflict, he had always prided himself on being patient and reasonable. He believed in talking things out, finding common ground, and giving people the benefit of the doubt. Now, though, he saw the world differently. He realized that kindness and compromise weren't always rewarded, and that sometimes standing your ground meant risking everything. The neighborhood, too, was forever changed. Conversations around backyard barbecues and community meetings carried an unspoken weight. People avoided discussing Jack directly, but his name lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Some viewed him as a hero, a man who refused to be pushed around by authority figures. Others saw him as reckless, someone who let anger cloud his judgment. Either way, no one forgot what happened. The spike strips became legend, whispered about by newcomers and used as a cautionary tale by those who remembered the chaos. Jack noticed subtle changes in how people treated him. Neighbors who once waved hello now looked away when their paths crossed. Delivery drivers hesitated before pulling into his driveway, as if expecting some new trap to spring up. Even the mail carrier seemed reluctant to step out of her truck, clutching letters tightly before hurrying off. It stung, knowing he had become a pariah in his own community. But deep down, Jack understood why. He had challenged the status quo, disrupted routines, and forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about entitlement and fairness. Not everyone appreciated that. Despite the isolation, Jack found solace in unexpected places. A few old-timers, retired farmers and ranchers who lived on the outskirts of town, reached out to offer support. They dropped by with homemade pies, tools they thought he might need, or simply stories of their own battles with HOAs and overzealous neighbors. One elderly man told Jack about a similar dispute decades ago, where he had chained his gate shut to keep trespassers out. "Sometimes you gotta remind folks that boundaries matter," the man said with a chuckle, "even if it ruffles feathers." These visits reminded Jack that he wasn't entirely alone. There were others who understood what it meant to fight for your land and your dignity. Their solidarity gave him strength, even as he faced the lingering consequences of his actions. The financial burden of the lawsuit weighed heavily on him. Paying restitution and legal fees drained his savings. He cut corners wherever he could, skipping unnecessary repairs and rationing supplies. It wasn't easy, but he preferred scraping by to giving up the ranch. This place was more than just property. It was home, history, and heart. Years later, sitting on his porch as twilight painted the horizon in hues of purple and gold, Jack reflected on everything that had happened. The anger and frustration had dulled with time, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He knew he'd made mistakes. Installing spike strips probably wasn't the smartest move, but he also knew he couldn't have stood idly by while others trampled his land. Standing up for himself, even imperfectly, had taught him valuable lessons about resilience, courage, and the cost of doing what you believe is right. The ranch looked different now. New fences lined the edges of the property, stronger and taller than before. Signs declaring private property, no trespassing, dotted the landscape, bold and unmissable. Jack had learned that clear boundaries mattered, not just for keeping people out, but for reminding himself of what he valued most: independence, integrity, and peace of mind. Every so often, he'd see a car slow down near the edge of his field, curiosity evident in the driver's gaze. They'd glance at the signs, hesitate for a moment, then speed away. Each time this happened, Jack felt a flicker of satisfaction. His message had been received loud and clear. This land was his, and he wouldn't tolerate disrespect anymore. There were nights when Jack wondered if he could have handled things differently. Could he have avoided the spike strips altogether? Found another way to stop the trespassing? Maybe. But dwelling on what-ifs wouldn't change the past. What mattered was that he had stood firm when it counted, refusing to let anyone take advantage of him or his land. In the end, Jack decided that fighting for what you love, even at great personal cost, is never a waste. Sure, he had lost friends, money, and trust along the way. But he had gained something far more valuable: clarity. He knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. And as long as he had his ranch, his principles, and the quiet beauty of the countryside surrounding him, he figured he'd be okay. The sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. Jack leaned back in his chair, listening to the crickets chirp and the wind rustle through the trees. Life wasn't perfect, but it was his, and for now that was enough.